Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, like always, and give you the crucial insights on some really complex global issues. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the very fabric of global power shifts. We're exploring how states try to wield influence and, maybe just as importantly, the surprising limits of their power. We've pulled together a pretty rich stack of sources for you, stuff from leading think tanks like the Atlantic Council, the Quincy Institute, detailed reports from places like the Institute for the Study of War, and even some, interesting online discussions that show how different people are seeing things. Our mission today is to really unpack two pivotal geopolitical flashpoints. First, that long-term strategic rivalry between the U.S. and China. And second, the really volatile, actively escalating conflict between Iran and Israel. We want to help you understand the tools states use, or try to use, to get their way in what's clearly an increasingly competitive world.
Yeah, and what's striking, I think, is how these things that seem separate, a strategic policy shift in Washington on one side and a hot conflict in the Middle East on the other, they're fundamentally interconnected. It all comes down to these underlying themes of power, influence, and the constant struggle to shape the international order. So we'll be looking at how great powers attempt to manage threats and, frankly, what happens when those strategies collide, often with really unexpected results.
Okay, so let's start there with that first connection, this big recalibration we're seeing in U.S. defense strategy. Our sources point to a clear, very deliberate move in Washington, prioritizing China as the principal threat.
Right. Before, you had both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration kind of balancing things, right? Looking at the Indo-Pacific and Europe, treating China and Russia almost as these twin risks. Well, now the current Trump administration is reportedly shifting gears, as one source put it. The Department of Defense, the DoD, is organizing its strategy around China as the sole principal threat. And what's interesting is many defense planners actually seem to welcome this focus.
Really? Why is that?
Well, they've argued for a long time that trying to manage too many big threats at once, especially without a big budget increase to match, just makes effective planning incredibly difficult. You get overextended.
Okay, overextension, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But making such a focused shift, what are the real-world implications? I mean, does focusing solely on China leave other areas vulnerable?
Yeah.
Or does it actually free up resources more effectively?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The core issue isn't really whether the U.S. engages globally, our sources suggest it has to, but it's how to stop that overextension making threat management, ineffective. To really position China as the primary threat, the U.S. military needs a pretty radical restructuring of its forces. The sources we looked at highlight some critical shifts needed to properly deter China in the Indo-Pacific. Things like developing and deploying long-range fires.
Big missiles and things.
Exactly. And enhancing the ability to move forces quickly, protecting critical defense infrastructure, and crucially, securing more basing options over there in the region. It sounds like it's about being precise, not just present everywhere.
Okay, so that's one side. At this laser focus on China as the number one challenge. But our sources also give us a more, let's say, nuanced perspective on the U.S.-China dynamic itself, especially when you look at how they view the international order. It's quite a contrast. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, for instance, views the People's Republic of China as the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. Why? Because of its intent and its growing power to reshape things economically, diplomatically, militarily, technologically. The Biden administration apparently frames China as having a revisionist foreign policy, actively undermining existing rules and institutions.
But then here's the flip side. The Chinese government argues pretty forcefully that the United States is the one undermining the international order. They point to unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying hegemonism, saying the U.S. imposes rules that just serve its own interests. So this is where it gets really interesting, something the Quincy Institute highlighted. Each side claims it's defending the existing international order against the threat the other poses.
Huh. So they both claim to be the defenders of the status quo.
In a way, yeah. It suggests this may be crucial truth, that both the U.S. and China are fundamentally status quo powers. They both share a deep interest in a stable global security environment and an open global economy. They need that stability.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to frame it. But hold on. Given China's rapid expansion, look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Isn't there an argument that even if you call yourself a status quo power, you can still be profoundly revisionist in how you approach global norms, even while claiming you want stability?
Absolutely. That's the core tension right there. While both might want stability, their vision of what that ideal international order looks like and how you get there, that differs quite a bit. And this raises a huge question. Can these two powers, despite all the accusations flying back and forth, despite the competing visions, actually find common ground? Can they work on some kind of shared reform agenda? Our sources do indicate China has repeatedly sought cooperation. Back in 2021, President Xi apparently told President Biden that China's global projects were open to the U.S. And he listed areas for cooperation: the economy, energy, military-to-military talks, law enforcement, education, science and tech, climate change. Quite a list.
And historically, they have worked together on big things, haven't they?
They have. Sino-American alignment was absolutely crucial for the Paris Climate Accords. They worked closely during the 2014 Ebola epidemic, too, and maybe surprisingly, the Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, that was the first treaty signed after they established diplomatic relations back in '79. It was recently extended for 6 months, even with all the calls to cut ties. China also argues for, spreading authority more broadly in global governance. They want more influence for states representing the global majority in places like the UN, the IMF, World Bank, WTO. Economically, well, China's the largest provider of bilateral development financing globally, mostly through the Belt and Road. And they've set up new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And on climate, China's making arguably the most rapid transition towards sustainability. They're on track to install more solar power capacity in just 1 year than the entire existing U.S. capacity in 2023. And they account for over half of global EV sales. It's significant.
So it's this really complex picture, isn't it? Competition, yes, but also potential cooperation, or at least areas where interests might align. But then there's this growing skepticism you mentioned from third parties about U.S. intentions. The Quincy Institute highlights this idea that other countries are starting to suspect the U.S. is, and I'm quoting here, more committed to weaponizing its own influence to remain atop a disintegrating system than to revitalizing the international order.
Yeah, and you see leaders like Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema saying it out loud. He said, "When I'm in Washington, I'm not against Beijing. Equally, when I'm in Beijing, I'm not against Washington. We have a globe we share. What we expect of America and China is to help us keep our world safe for everybody."
Wow, that's pretty direct.
It is, and it really shines a light on a critical challenge for U.S. leaders. How do you best engage? The Quincy Institute suggests maybe abandoning this knee-jerk desire to counter China in all its activities. Instead, they propose something called common good diplomacy. Basically, distinguish between things that are beneficial and things that are damaging, affirm constructive Chinese proposals when they happen, manage the differences through negotiation, and aim for inclusion for everyone, not just your allies. It's really a call for a more pragmatic, maybe less adversarial approach, particularly where mutual interests might actually exist.
A very different way to think about navigating these global power dynamics. Okay, so let's pivot now. Let's move to a very immediate, very intense situation. The escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. This gives us a stark, real-world case study of how these dynamics play out in a hot conflict and what happens when states really try to coerce each other. Things escalated incredibly rapidly in mid-June 2025. June 13th, an Israeli airstrike on Iran's nuclear facilities seems to have ignited this current phase. Then, the very next day, June 14th, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, hit a natural gas processing facility and refinery. This caused a partial shutdown at South Pars, one of the world's biggest gas fields.
And by June 17th, 18th, the whole diplomatic climate, regionally and internationally, became, as one source described it, increasingly brittle. Tehran issued pretty stark warnings. If the U.S. intervened directly for Israel, Iran would shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That's a huge choke point for global oil. Russia, meanwhile, publicly condemned Israel's strikes, called them a violation of international law, and even revived an old proposal to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium, maybe hinting at a way to de-escalate.
But the escalation didn't stop there. June 19th, 20th, U.S. military planners were apparently prepping something called Operation Midnight Hammer. The goal: dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure in one coordinated strike. And then, June 21st, the U.S. conducted its largest direct strike on Iranian soil in decades. Stealth bombers hit 3 critical Iranian nuclear sites with these massive bunker-buster bombs. They targeted Fordo, the enrichment facility that's buried deep under a mountain. Post-strike satellite images apparently showed parts of the mountain literally torn open, tunnel entrances destroyed. These strikes, plus ongoing Israeli operations, are being called the most serious blow to the Islamic Republic since its war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq back in the 80s.
And Iran's response: they launched Operation True Promise III. This involved between 500 and 550 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 drones fired between June 13th and June 24th. Now, that sounds like a huge number, but the largest single barrage was actually around 40 missiles. That's significantly smaller than the 100 missiles per barrage Iran used in its attack on Israel back in October 2024.
So what was the impact of all this? The strikes on Iran, their response, what did it achieve?
Well, the impact on Iran's capabilities seems pretty significant. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, Iran's enrichment capabilities have been, quote, effectively destroyed. And it'll take a long time for them to rebuild to pre-strike levels. Key facilities like Natanz and Fordo were hit hard, lots of centrifuges lost. Beyond the infrastructure, at least 14 Iranian nuclear scientists were reportedly killed, including a weapons expert working on stuff that simulates nuclear detonation effects. And the Israeli killing of senior Iranian military officers, particularly in the IRGC, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's said to have really disrupted their command structure. Plus, Israeli strikes hit Iranian energy infrastructure and sites linked to domestic surveillance. This caused severe economic disruption and apparently degraded the regime's ability to repress its increasingly restive population. So overall, Iran's capabilities, including its proxy network, the axis of resistance, its air defenses, its missile forces, they're all significantly degraded.
Okay, so Iran's taken a massive hit. Given that intense pressure, what does this mean for their ability to actually hit back? And what about broader regional stability?
Well, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei faces a really tough decision now, doesn't he? How do you rebuild deterrence against the U.S. and Israel without inviting even more escalation? It's a fine line.
What are their options? Realistic?
Well, potential options include, more missile and drone strikes, even with degraded forces.
Right.
Proxy attacks using militias in Iraq or the Houthis. Naval aggression, like threatening the Strait of Hormuz again. And maybe activating covert terror cells abroad. But here's the thing about their recent attacks. Israeli air defenses proved remarkably effective. They intercepted something like 89% of the ballistic missiles and nearly 100%, 99.99% of the drones. Out of over 500 ballistic missiles launched, only about 60 actually impacted in Israel. Tragically, those resulted in 28 deaths. And the vast majority of those impacts, 55 out of 60, were in civilian areas. Only 5 hit military or energy targets. Our sources stress that Iranian ballistic missiles just don't have pinpoint accuracy. Their CAP, or circular error probable, is somewhere between 20 and 500 meters for the medium-range ones. So while some online discussions were debating how effective Iran's response was, claims of, major hits on Israeli oil refineries or Netanyahu fleeing the country, those were pretty widely disputed even within those forums.
It really sounds like this has created a kind of new normal for the region. One source said further conflict with Iran as well as Iranian retaliation could erupt at any time. That's unsettling.
It is. And Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has already told the IDF to prepare an enforcement plan. Things like maintaining air superiority, preventing Iran from producing nuclear materials or missiles, and responding to any Iranian support for terrorist activities against Israel. But here's a major complication tangled up in all this: the Israel-Palestine issue. It remains a huge obstacle to regional stability. The current Netanyahu government shows zero indication of supporting an independent Palestinian state, and that makes normalization, say with Saudi Arabia, extremely difficult. Saudi Crown Prince MBS, he reportedly wants a binding security pact with the U.S., but he faces massive public opposition at home to formal ties with Israel, especially because of the ongoing conflict in Gaza.
And how did other major powers react to this latest round of escalation?
Well, Russia, as we mentioned, publicly condemned Israel's airstrikes, called them a violation of international law, stressed Iran's adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, its openness to diplomacy. Moscow even revived that offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium, trying to de-escalate. China called for an immediate ceasefire, warned against attacks on nuclear facilities, and reiterated its opposition to nuclear proliferation, especially in Asia. They also indicated they'd likely sanction Pakistan if it were ever to send nukes to Iran, noting, interestingly, that Pakistan is an American ally. It just shows you the complex web of interests here.
Okay, this whole Iran-Israel situation provides a really critical and maybe sobering look at this core foreign policy concept, military coercion. Let's really unpack that. What is it, and why is it so darn tricky to get right?
Yeah, I think a key thing to grasp here is the precise difference between coercion and just, full-scale war. Coercion is about using military force indirectly. You're trying to persuade someone else to behave the way you want, usually by changing the costs and benefits they see in their choices. War, on the other hand, aims to get what you want directly by physically imposing your will, destroying target, basically removing the other side's choice altogether. And what's really striking is, even though the U.S. was the world's dominant power from, say, 1991 to 2018, its attempts to coerce other states failed as often as they succeeded.
Failed as often as they succeeded.
Yeah.
Wow. That really tells you that just having military power doesn't guarantee you can make others do what you want.
Exactly. Military might alone isn't enough.
And our sources also show this big rise in using economic sanctions alongside military pressure, right? Between 91 and 2018, the U.S. hit 101 states with 252 sanctions. That's way more than the 191 sanctions against 74 states in the previous 44 years. So if it fails half the time, what actually makes coercion work when it does?
Well, success seems to hinge on a few crucial factors. First, you absolutely have to understand the target's incentive structure, what actually motivates them. Studies on U.S. attempts to coerce Saddam Hussein, for example, showed that a poor grasp of his motivations, his prioritized order of interests, led to, well, spectacular failure. Second is credibility. Do they actually believe you'll follow through on your warnings? That red line incident in Syria under Obama is often brought up here. The failure to act after Assad crossed it was widely seen as damaging U.S. credibility.
Okay, so understanding the target and being believable. What else?
Third is resolve. This is about your own willingness to accept costs to get what you want. Weaker actors often have existential interests at stake. Their survival might be on the line. That makes them incredibly resistant to coercion because they might be willing to endure enormous pain. And finally, it's about integrated power. Success in this kind of competition requires the concerted and disciplined use of military, economic, and socio-political power. You can't rely on just one tool.
Right, using all the tools in the toolbox. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive for a superpower. Domestic politics can play a huge role in whether a state is actually willing to exert coercion, especially democracies.
That's absolutely right. In liberal democracies, leaders are constrained by what their voters want, right? And that often leads to what's called a public aversion to casualties.
People don't want to see their soldiers coming home in body bags.
Exactly. And this casualty aversion can make leaders hesitant. They might not fully follow through on threats, especially if the interests at stake for the stronger country, like the U.S., seem less, well, existential than those of the weaker country being targeted. And adversaries can potentially exploit this. They might calculate that the U.S. just won't tolerate significant costs. Unfortunately, as one source puts it, the U.S. has gained a reputation for having a low-cost tolerance, particularly concerning U.S. casualties. And that can really limit its willingness to commit ground troops or make good on threats, potentially undermining its own attempts at coercion.
So if we tie all this together, both the U.S. strategic pivot towards China and this incredibly volatile Iran-Israel conflict, they really illustrate the profound complexities of managing power today in the 21st century. It shows us that military might, yeah, it's foundational, it matters, but it's only one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Precisely. Understanding motivations, demonstrating consistent resolve, and truly integrating all the instruments of statecraft, diplomatic, economic, military implications. Those seem absolutely vital for navigating this really competitive and rapidly changing world.
Yeah. Whether you're trying to manage a long-term strategic rivalry or de-escalate a hot conflict, success seems to hinge on nuanced understanding, precision in applying pressure, but also being really mindful of international perceptions and your own domestic constraints.
It's a constant balancing act.
So thinking about everything we've unpacked today, what stands out to you from this deep dive? How do you think these global power shifts are going to keep unfolding, and what role will this idea of integrated statecraft really play in shaping what comes next?
And maybe one final thought for you to chew on. Consider how the increasing interconnectedness of our global economy, everything from trade networks to energy supply chains, how that might both fuel and constrain major power conflicts. Could it actually force nations to think beyond just immediate military goals and consider much broader consequences? Something to think about.